The year was 1944, and the grand French city of Lille stood frozen in a peculiar kind of terror. For 4 long years, the occupation had turned everyday life into a choreographed dance of survival, where one misplaced word meant disappearance. But on a sweltering August afternoon, something far worse than occupation was descending upon 100,000 souls. Hidden in a command bunker, an SS general had just authorized Order 77, and scorched earth command to reduce the city's heart to rubble before the Allies arrived. The explosives were set, the detonators were primed, and the only thing standing between Lille and total annihilation was a 24-year-old woman in a wool coat sitting in a cramped exchange room. Her name was Odette Vaneau, and she was about to make a mistake that would save more lives than any deliberate act of heroism ever could. This is the story they never taught you in history class: how one woman's exhaustion stopped a massacre. Odette was nobody special, the quiet daughter of a local clockmaker. The Germans kept her at the Lille Central Exchange because she seemed too unremarkable to be dangerous. They'd never suspected she was a secret shadow of the Jade Fitzroy resistance. But on this morning, Odette was a ghost of herself, hallucinating after a 30-hour shift. As the general barked the code for the city's center, Alpha 9, the static and the fog in her mind twisted the sounds. Her pen scratched a different reality: Delta 9. It was a simple clerical error, the kind that happens 1,000 times a day, except this time it redirected the signals to an empty industrial shipyard, sparing 100,000 lives because of a single wrong letter. The Lille Central Exchange was a cathedral of paranoia. Rows of operators sat like penitents before vertical panels bristling with jacks and cords, their hands moving in constant prayer to connect the voices of an occupying army. The air tasted of copper wire and cigarette smoke, thick enough to coat the back of your throat. Odette Vaneau had been breathing it for 30 hours straight. Her father had been a clockmaker, a man who taught her that precision was survival. Every gear had its place, every spring its tension. One mistake could stop time itself. Now she sat at Position 7, the strategic hub where military calls were routed, and that childhood lesson had become a prophecy she couldn't escape. Her hands trembled as she pulled cords and pushed plugs, connecting conversations that decided who lived and who disappeared into the night. The Germans had chosen her precisely because she seemed invisible. Plain features, quiet demeanor, the kind of woman who blended into wallpaper. What they didn't know was that invisibility made the perfect camouflage. For 18 months, Odette had been funneling intelligence to the réseau Jade Fitzroy, a resistance network that operated in the shadows between telephone lines. Every Wehrmacht troop movement, every supply shipment, every petty argument between officers, she heard it all, remembered it all, and passed it along through a flower shop owner who never sold flowers after dark. But tonight, precision was abandoning her. The fluorescent lights overhead had begun to pulse like a heartbeat, and the voice of the operator beside her sounded like it was coming from underwater. Odette's vision blurred at the edges. She'd been awake so long that reality was starting to fray, showing her glimpses of a world that wasn't quite there. Shadows moved in corners where nothing stood. The clicking of the switchboard transformed into Morse code messages her mind couldn't decode. She pressed her palms against her eyes, trying to ground herself. Her younger brother Mark was somewhere in this city, probably huddled in the basement of their apartment, waiting for her to come home. That thought alone kept her upright. Mark was 17, too young to fight, but old enough to be taken for labor. Every day Odette stayed alive, every shift she completed without error was another day the Germans didn't look too closely at her family. The supervisor, Frau Becker, stalked between the rows like a prison warden, her heels clicking against the tile floor. She stopped behind Odette's chair, and the temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Vaneau, you look unwell." Odette's spine straightened by instinct. "I'm fine, Frau Becker." "Fine isn't good enough. This position requires excellence." The woman's breath smelled of schnapps. "One mistake here, and soldiers die. You understand this, yes?" "Yes, Frau Becker." The supervisor moved on, but her words hung in the air like poison gas. One mistake. That was all it ever took. Odette had built her entire life around the certainty that perfection was the only shield against chaos. Her father's clocks never lost a second. Her schoolwork never earned top marks. At the exchange, her connection rate was flawless, 309 consecutive shifts without a single misrouted call. But tonight, she could feel that record slipping through her fingers like water. At 2:14 p.m., the switchboard lit up with an incoming call from the command bunker. Priority 1. Odette's stomach clenched as she saw the designation. Priority 1 meant decisions that shaped the war, conversations that couldn't be delayed or questioned. She plugged in the cord with shaking hands. "Lille Central, connecting." The voice that came through was ice wrapped in razor wire. SS Brigade Führer Ernst Keller, the architect of occupation terror, the man who'd ordered the execution of 83 resistance members in the square last winter. Odette had memorized his voice from 100 previous calls, learned to recognize the particular cadence of his cruelty. "Connect me to Demolition's command. Authorization Omega Black." Odette's fingers found the correct jack without conscious thought, muscle memory taking over where her exhausted mind faltered. She patched him through and, as protocol demanded, kept the line open to log the transmission. What she heard next turned her blood to slush. "This is Order 77. Execute the Alpha 9 demolition protocol at 1800 hours. Confirm receipt." The response crackled back. "Alpha 9 confirmed. Historic District and Residential Sectors 4 through 12. Estimated civilian casualties 100,000 plus or minus 15,000. Keller's voice never wavered. "The Allies want a liberation. We'll leave them a graveyard. They can count corpses instead of celebrating. Make sure the charges are synchronized. I want the entire sector to collapse simultaneously. No survivors, no witnesses." "Understood, Brigade Führer. The glory of—" "Save your speeches. Just blow the city to hell." The line went dead. Odette sat frozen, the headset pressed against her ear, hearing nothing but the roar of her own heartbeat. 100,000 people. The historic district was where families still lived, where children played in the streets despite the occupation, where old women still tended window boxes full of geraniums. The Germans had spent 4 years draining Lille of life. Now they wanted to erase it entirely from the map. Her training screamed at her to log the call and move on. Her conscience screamed something else entirely. But before she could reconcile the war inside her head, another light blazed on the switchboard, another call, then another. The board erupted into a constellation of urgent connections, and Odette's hands moved on autopilot, pulling cords and making connections, a machine trying desperately to remember how to be human. If you can't stand people who would murder innocents just to deny their enemies a victory, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments. Type, "Nobody deserves that." because what happened next only got worse. Odette's shift log lay open on the desk beside her, a neat column of numbers and sector codes that documented every call she'd connected. Her handwriting was usually immaculate, another inheritance from her father, who believed that sloppy penmanship revealed a sloppy mind. But as she reached for her pen to record Order 77, her vision doubled. The fluorescent lights overhead had begun to strobe, or perhaps that was just her brain misfiring. The numbers on the switchboard swam like fish. She blinked hard, trying to force her eyes to focus, but exhaustion had moved beyond physical discomfort into something closer to fever dream. She could hear her father's voice in her memory. "Precision, Odette. Precision is what separates order from chaos." Her pen touched paper. Alpha 9. That's what Keller had said. Alpha 9. She could hear it echoing in her memory, could see the sector map in her mind's eye, the warren of medieval streets, the cathedral with its 700-year-old rose window, the apartment where Mark waited for her. But as she wrote, the static from the headset still buzzing in her ears mixed with the drone of exhaustion, and the letters shifted under her pen. The A curved wrong, became a D. The muscle memory of her hand, trained to transcribe its speed, locked into the wrong pattern. Delta 9. She stared at what she'd written, trying to make sense of it. But another call was already flashing on the board, and Frau Becker was watching, and she couldn't afford to pause, couldn't afford to second-guess. She tore the page from the log, folded it twice, and dropped it into the routing basket. Standard procedure. The demolitions team would receive her transcription within the hour, would use it to confirm their targets, would set their timers accordingly. Delta 9, the abandoned shipyard district, 3 kilometers of empty warehouses and rusted cranes, cleared out 2 years ago when the Germans stripped it for scrap metal. Nothing there but rats and seagulls and the ghosts of an industrial age. Odette's hands returned to the switchboard, connecting a call about ammunition requisitions, then another about patrol schedules. The rhythm of the work was hypnotic, almost meditative. She didn't think about what she'd written, didn't let herself think about it. Thinking meant recognizing the magnitude of the error, and recognition meant panic, and panic meant Frau Becker noticing, and that meant questions she couldn't answer. So she simply kept working, kept connecting, kept pretending that nothing had changed, that she hadn't just rewritten the fate of a city with a single wrong letter. At 6 p.m., Lille shuddered. The explosion rolled across the city like thunder, shaking windows and rattling dishes, sending flocks of pigeons into panicked flight. Odette felt it through the floor of the exchange, a deep subsonic rumble that made her teeth ache. Around her, the other operators looked up from their boards, eyes wide. Frau Becker burst from her office. What was that? But the answer came before anyone could respond. The telephone lines erupted with frantic calls, Wehrmacht officers demanding status reports, police asking for instructions, local commanders shouting about smoke rising from the harbor district. Odette's board lit up like a Christmas tree, and she began making connections with numb mechanical efficiency. Through the snippets of conversation, a picture emerged. The explosion had been massive, catastrophic, a fireball that painted the evening sky orange and sent a mushroom cloud rising above the waterfront. But it was in the wrong place. The historic district stood untouched. The residential sectors were intact. Instead, the abandoned shipyard had been transformed into a crater, twisted metal and burning debris scattered across 3 kilometers of wasteland. Odette felt the blood drain from her face. She understood with sudden crystalline clarity what had happened. Her mistake had redirected the demolition order. The charges meant for Alpha 9 had been relocated to Delta 9. The technical crews, following her transcription to the letter, had moved their carefully planted explosives to a sector of the city that no longer mattered. 100,000 people had just been saved by her exhaustion. Or had they? Was this really her error, or had some part of her subconscious recognized the horror of what was coming and deliberately sabotaged the transmission? She searched her memory of that moment, trying to reconstruct her intentions, but found only fog. She genuinely didn't know if she'd made a mistake or made a choice. Around her, the exchange descended into controlled chaos. The Wehrmacht was scrambling to understand what had gone wrong. The demolitions command was insisting they'd followed orders exactly. Someone was going to start asking questions about who transcribed Order 77. Odette kept her face carefully neutral, kept her hands steady on the switchboard, kept connecting calls like nothing had changed. But inside, a countdown had begun. She had hours, maybe less, before someone traced the error back to her position. If you believe innocent lives matter more than military strategy, hit that subscribe button. People like Brigade Führer Keller won't, and you need to hear what happened when he started looking for someone to blame. Major Klaus Henschel arrived at the Lille Central Exchange at dawn the next morning. He was a different species of German officer. No theatrical cruelty, no bombastic speeches. Just a thin man in a perfectly pressed uniform, carrying a leather briefcase and wearing the expression of an accountant who'd found an error in the books. Odette watched him enter through the glass partition that separated the operators from the administrative offices. She'd been at her station for another full shift, unable to leave, unable to sleep, trapped in the amber of her own paranoia. Every time the door opened, she expected SS officers. Every time a call came through, she expected it to be about her. But Henschel didn't storm in with accusations. He simply set up a desk in the corner, opened his briefcase, and began methodically reviewing paperwork. For 3 hours, he worked in silence, occasionally calling over Frau Becker to ask quiet questions. The supervisor's answers grew increasingly nervous. Odette learned his story in fragments from the other operators. Henschel was a logistics specialist, a man who'd spent the war tracking supply chains and uncovering inefficiencies. He'd exposed 14 separate cases of corruption and sabotage, sending 3 colonels and a general to face firing squads. His nickname in the Wehrmacht was der Uhrmacher, the watchmaker, because he could disassemble any system and find the broken gear. When he finally approached Odette's station, she felt her heart climb into her throat. Fräulein Vaneau. His French was perfect, almost too perfect. I need to review your shift logs from yesterday. She retrieved the logbook with hands that somehow didn't shake, passed it across the desk. Henschel flipped to the relevant page, his eyes scanning the neat columns of her handwriting. He studied it for a long moment, then looked up at her. You've been working here how long? 18 months, Major. And your error rate? 0, Major. Until yesterday. Interesting. He tapped the logbook with one precise finger. A perfect record, and then suddenly you transposed Alpha for Delta. These letters look nothing alike. They sound nothing alike. The acoustic difference is substantial. Odette forced herself to meet his eyes. I'd been on shift for 30 hours, Major. I was exhausted. Yes, I've reviewed the scheduling records. Frau Becker kept you working well beyond standard limits. He glanced toward the supervisor's office with an expression that might have been disapproval. Exhaustion causes errors, but this particular error is statistically improbable. The letters don't match in sound or shape. A tired person makes simple mistakes, writes the same number twice, skips a digit. They don't perform complex substitutions. I don't know what to tell you, Major. I made a mistake. Or someone made you make a mistake. He closed the logbook gently. The Rousseau Jade Fitzroy has been very active in Lille, very clever. They don't sabotage equipment, too obvious. They manipulate information, false reports, redirected orders, corrupted intelligence. It's much harder to trace. Odette's pulse hammered in her ears, but she kept her voice steady. I'm not part of any resistance network, Major. No? He reached into his briefcase, pulled out a photograph. It showed Odette leaving the exchange 6 weeks ago, captured by a surveillance camera she hadn't known existed. In the photograph, she was glancing over her shoulder, the exact gesture of someone checking for pursuit. You look nervous in this image, Fraulein Vaneau, like someone with something to hide. Everyone looks nervous during an occupation, Major. Henschel smiled, and it was the coldest thing Odette had ever seen. Yes, but most people aren't responsible for saving 100,000 lives, intentionally or not. Odette worked her shift in a fog of dread, knowing Henschel was watching her from his corner desk, knowing that every movement was being cataloged and analyzed. When Frau Becker finally released her at 2 p.m., she stumbled out of the exchange into afternoon sunlight that felt alien and hostile. The streets of Lille had transformed overnight. Wehrmacht soldiers patrolled in doubled numbers, checking papers at random, eyeing civilians with open suspicion. The failed demolition had turned the occupation paranoid. If the resistance could manipulate a demolition order, what else could they corrupt? Odette walked the 3 kilometers to her apartment with her head down, taking random turns to check for followers, using every technique the Jade Fitzroy contact had taught her. The flower shop was closed, its windows dark. Not a good sign. When the resistance went silent, it usually meant they detected a threat. Her apartment building stood in a narrow street near the cathedral, a 5-story structure with peeling paint and a courtyard that smelled of cooking cabbage. She climbed to the 3rd floor, her legs heavy as concrete, and unlocked the door to find the apartment empty. Mark wasn't there. His school books sat neatly stacked on the table. His bed was made with military precision, but her brother was gone. In his place, a single note written in German. Your brother is helping us with inquiries. Come to Citadel Saint-Maurice at 8 p.m. Come alone. H. Odette's legs gave out. She sank to the floor, the note crumpling in her fist. The Citadel was the fortress the Wehrmacht had converted into their regional headquarters, a medieval stronghold with walls 3 meters thick and a garrison of 200 soldiers. No one came out of the Citadel unless the Germans wanted them to. It was where they took people to extract confessions, to break spirits, to make examples. They had Mark. They had her gentle, brilliant brother who'd never hurt anyone, who spent his evenings reading philosophy and dreaming of becoming a teacher. They had him because of her, because Henschel had connected the dots and decided that pressure was the most effective tool. The resistance protocol was clear. If they take family members, you run. You don't negotiate, don't try to rescue, don't give them the satisfaction of watching you break. The network is more important than any individual. Odette had agreed to those terms when she'd first made contact, had signed her name to that cold logic. But that was before Mark's face was on the other side of the equation. She stood up, washed her face, changed into dark clothes. The decision had already made itself. Protocol could burn. the resistance could find another operator. She was going to get her brother out of that fortress, even if it meant confirming every suspicion Henschel had about her. Odette didn't go to the Citadel at 8 p.m. She went to the Lille Central Exchange at 7 p.m. instead, using her night shift credentials to slip past the skeleton crew. Frau Becker was gone, the administrative offices were dark, and only 2 other operators were on duty, both focused on their own boards. She sat at her old position and stared at the switchboard. This labyrinth of copper wire and circuit connections wasn't just a communication system, it was the nervous system of the occupation. Every German command post, every patrol station, every guard tower was connected to this board, and Odette knew exactly how to give that nervous system a stroke. Her hands moved across the board with the muscle memory of 18 months, pulling connections and rerouting circuits. She wasn't making calls, she was breaking them, systematically isolating the Citadel San Maurice from every other German position in the city. When she was finished, the fortress would be deaf and mute, unable to call for reinforcements or coordinate with external patrols. The 2 other operators never looked up from their work. Why would they? Odette Vaneau was perfect, reliable, the operator who never made mistakes. At 7:45, she pulled the final connection, and the Citadel went dark on the board. She stood, smoothed her coat, and walked out of the exchange for the last time. The streets were emptying as curfew approached, civilians hurrying home before the Wehrmacht patrols turned aggressive. Odette moved in the opposite direction, toward the medieval quarter where the Citadel loomed against the darkening sky. She had 15 minutes before Henschel expected her, 15 minutes while the fortress was isolated and confused. She wasn't going in the front gate. The Jade Fitzroy had mapped every inch of the old city, including the medieval storm drains that ran beneath the Citadel's foundations. The entrance was in a cellar 3 blocks away, hidden behind stacked wine barrels. Odette had memorized the route 6 months ago, part of standard resistance training she'd never expected to use. The drain was barely wide enough for her shoulders, the darkness absolute, the smell of stagnant water overwhelming. She crawled through centuries of accumulated filth, her hands finding purchase on slick stone, her breathing echoing in the confined space. Time stopped meaning anything in that blackness. She might have been crawling for minutes or hours. When she finally emerged, it was into a sub-basement storage room that hadn't been opened since the fortress was built in the 1600s. Above her, she could hear voices shouting in German, boots running on stone floors. The communication blackout had done its job. The garrison was in chaos, unable to coordinate, unable to call for guidance. Odette found the access stairs and climbed toward the sound of confusion, toward wherever they were keeping her brother, toward the moment when everything she'd built would finally collapse. Lives before orders if you're Team Odette. The Reich's cruelty can't win. Now watch what happens when she finally fights back. Mark was in a cell on the 3rd floor, exactly where the Jade Fitzroy intelligence had predicted prisoners of interest would be held. Odette found him through blind luck and systematic searching, opening door after door in the chaos until she saw his face through a barred window. He looked up, eyes widening in recognition and horror. "Odette, what are you—" "Quiet." She worked the lock with a piece of wire, another skill the resistance had taught her. The mechanism clicked, and the door swung open. Mark stumbled out, and she grabbed his arm. We have maybe 5 minutes before they organize. Don't talk, just run." They retraced her route through the sub-basement, through the storm drain, emerging into the cellar just as air raid sirens began wailing across the city. Not a real air raid. Odette had arranged for a false alarm through one of her final switchboard manipulations, one last gift of chaos to cover their escape. But as they climbed out of the cellar into the street, a figure stepped from the shadows. Major Henschel stood alone, no backup, no weapon drawn, just that same cold, analytical expression. "Very impressive, Fraulein Vane. The communication blackout, the false alarm, the medieval drain route. You've been well trained." Odette pushed Mark behind her. "Let us go." "I could, but then I'd never prove my theory about Order 77. He tilted his head, studying her like a specimen under glass. "You didn't make a mistake, did you? That was deliberate. You're the saboteur I've been looking for. You'll never prove it. I don't need to prove it. I just need to know." He took a step closer. "Did you mean to save them, the 100,000? Or did you genuinely make an error, and luck just happened to align with virtue?" Odette met his eyes and realized that this moment, right here, was the only testimony that would ever exist. No trial, no records, no historical judgment. Just the two of them and the truth. "I was exhausted," she said quietly. "I'd been awake for 30 hours. My hands were shaking, my vision was blurred. I wrote Delta instead of Alpha because I could barely see the paper." "But you knew what you'd done afterward?" "Yes." Henschel nodded slowly. "So it was both an accident that became a choice, the most dangerous kind of resistance." He glanced at Mark, then back to Odette. "The Allies will be here in 3 days. The war's ending. If I arrest you now, I'll get a commendation, and you'll get a bullet. But my commendation won't matter in 3 days, will it?" He stepped aside, gesturing to the empty street. "The flower shop owner was arrested this morning. The Jade Fitzroy network in Lille is finished. If you run now, run far. There won't be anyone left to tell your story. You'll just be a telephone operator who made a very lucky mistake." Odette took Mark's hand and walked past Henschel, every muscle tensed for the shot that never came. They made it to the end of the street, and another, putting distance between themselves and the citadel. The air raid sirens continued to wail, and under their cover, 2 more people disappeared into the chaos of the war's final days. For 48 years, Odette Bernard lived in the English Cotswolds under the name Odette Vaneau. She worked as a librarian, married a quiet man who'd been in British intelligence during the war, raised 2 children who never knew their mother had once held the fate of a city in her exhausted hands. Mark became a professor of philosophy in Montreal, and they exchanged letters once a month, careful chronicles of ordinary lives that had been anything but. The world recorded August 18, 1944, as the day the German demolition of Lille mysteriously failed due to technical error. The explosive charges had somehow been moved to the wrong sector. The detonation controllers had malfunctioned. The Wehrmacht had bungled a straightforward scorched earth operation. Just another example of German inefficiency as the Reich collapsed. No one looked for a telephone operator. Why would they? The mistake was obviously technical, obviously systematic. One person couldn't have done that much damage by accident. But in 1992, a French historian researching Wehrmacht documents in the military archives found something curious. An internal investigation report about the Lille demolition, authored by Major Klaus Henschel. The report was clinically detailed, documenting every aspect of the failed operation, tracking the error back through the command chain to a single transcription mistake at the Lille Central Exchange. And at the bottom, in Henschel's precise handwriting, error attributed to operator fatigue, no evidence of intentional sabotage. Recommend improved oversight of civilian personnel under extended shifts. Case closed. The historian contacted Odette through Veteran Services, asked if she'd be willing to speak about her time at the exchange. She was 72 years old, still living in the Cotswolds, still going by Bernard. Mark had died 3 years earlier, and her husband had followed him 6 months after. There was nothing left to protect, so she told the truth, the whole truth. The 30-hour shift, the fog of exhaustion, the moment her pen scratched the wrong letter, the horror of realizing what she'd done or failed to do, the impossibility of knowing her own intentions. "I didn't mean to save them," she said, sitting in her garden with its neat rows of English roses. "I was just tired, so tired I could barely think. And when I realized the explosives were in the wrong place, I didn't fix it. I let 100,000 people live because I was too exhausted to correct my own mistake." The historian asked if she felt proud, if she felt like a hero. Odette was quiet for a long time, watching bees move between flowers. "I feel like someone who got lucky," she said finally. "Someone whose failure turned out to matter more than most people's successes. That's not heroism. That's just chance wearing human face." If you watched or listened up to this point, comment the country you're watching this from. Represent your country. Because stories like Odette's remind us that history doesn't just belong to the bold decisions and the grand plans. Sometimes it belongs to the exhausted, the uncertain, the people who make mistakes at exactly the right moment. The monument to the failed demolition still stands in central Lille, a sculpture of twisted metal salvaged from the shipyard explosion. Every August 18th, the city holds a memorial service for what didn't happen, for the catastrophe that never came. They don't know Odette's name. She requested anonymity even after her confession, wanting only the story to survive, not her face. But somewhere in the municipal archives, there's a photograph of the Lille Central Exchange from 1944. If you look carefully at position 7, you can just make out a young woman in a wool coat, her face exhausted and haunted, her hands poised over a switchboard that connected the city to its fate. She's not looking at the camera. She's looking at something beyond the frame, something the photographer couldn't capture. Maybe she's looking at the cathedral in the distance, or the streets where 100,000 people walked unknowing beneath the shadow of their own erasure. Or maybe she's just looking at nothing, the 1,000-yard stare of someone who's been awake for too long, whose grip on precision is slipping, whose perfect record is about to shatter in the most catastrophically beautiful way possible. One mistake, one letter, 100,000 lives. That's the story they never taught you in history class. Not because it wasn't important, but because it didn't fit the narratives we tell ourselves about how the world is saved. We want our heroes deliberate, our victories planned, our righteousness certain. But Odette Vaneau teaches us something more honest, that sometimes the most important acts are the ones we don't mean to commit, that exhaustion can be resistance, that imperfection can be grace, and that the line between accident and intention is thinner than any of us want to admit. She died in 1999, 7 years after finally telling her story and was buried in a quiet churchyard under her husband's name. No monument, no military honors, no grand recognition, just a simple stone that said she'd been loved, that she'd been kind, that she'd lived a full life. But in Lille, on August 18, every year, the bells still ring in the cathedral that wasn't destroyed, in the city that wasn't leveled, for the 100,000 who never knew how close they came to not existing. And if you listen carefully to those bells, maybe you can hear what Odette heard in that moment at the switchboard, the static and the exhaustion and the weight of a world that depended on her staying perfect right until the moment her imperfection saved everything. That's the truth about Order 77, about the mistake that wasn't quite a mistake, the accident that wasn't quite an accident, the woman who saved a city by being too tired to be perfect. History doesn't record these stories because they complicate our understanding of how change happens. They suggest that sometimes the greatest acts require us not to be heroic, but simply to be human, flawed, exhausted, uncertain, and trying our best in a moment when best isn't quite enough, but somehow turns out to be exactly what the world needed.